Last week, we started our S4 suspension build. We upgraded the struts to BC Racing coilovers, and at the same time we replaced the upper control arms with an adjustable set from 034 Motorsports. We went through the whole process, and at the end of the day, our front suspension install went really well. Today, we are continuing this car's suspension build, and as you can probably guess, we're moving on to the rear. Just like the front of the car, it is a completely unique process. Let's hope it goes just as smoothly. After getting all the parts out, we can start to talk about what makes the rear so much different than the front. Laying the front on the left and the rear on the right side by side, you might notice that the rear doesn't have a top. We gotta reuse a part from the stock suspension for that. You'll also notice that it's just a single control arm at the top in the rear, way different than the front. To make sense of this, let's look at what's on the car currently. Let's get a lay of the land for the rear suspension. It's quite a bit different than the front. It's a strut setup, which is different than the TT. Not only that, but the strut bolts directly into this top piece, which bolts onto the car. And the upper control arm, which connects to the spindle, bolts to that top piece as well. Which, as you can probably guess, is the part we've got to reuse. One thing that's not a lot different between the front and the rear of the car is the process for actually removing the OEM suspension. I started with the control arm bolt that bolts to the spindle, and then removed all the bolts connecting the top piece that we're reusing to the car. Once those were taken out, I brought back our friend the mallet to persuade this top bolt out. Just like the front, there's one final bolt on the lower control arm, and with it removed, the suspension comes right out. It's pretty cool how similar the process of removing the front and removing the rear is, despite the fact that they're kind of nothing alike. With the OEM rear suspension out, you can get a really good idea of how those new parts are going to fit in with this OEM top piece. Just like the front of the car, we need to put this piece together before we can actually install it into the car. To do that, the first thing you're going to want to remove is this upper control arm. Unlike the front of the car, this one was pretty stuck. After a bit of persuasion, it came right off, revealing what I think to be the longest bolt in this car. If you're reusing the upper control arm, you don't technically have to do this, but it's also a really good opportunity to look at the bushings that it has. Mine have definitely seen better days, so I'm glad we're replacing them. Now comes the bomb defusal step of this install. There's a bolt holding this strut into this top metal piece. Don't remove that bolt without spring compressors. This is under tension, so you want to make sure that the spring can't go anywhere before you give it permission to leave. With the spring properly compressed, it's as simple as breaking loose the bolt and taking it out. With everything apart, we can also take a second to look at the size difference between the BC Racing coil and the OEM suspension.
This here is how you adjust how hard or soft your suspension is, and well, it's in here.
I'll talk about how you actually adjust this in the ride height and dampening video. At the time, I didn't know if it was normal or good to be drilling holes into this structural piece. Eventually I did some research and made a decision on this, but that's a story for later. For today, I just set it to the same dampening as the front so that it was even front to rear and side to side. If you are going to drill a hole so you can adjust this easily, now is the better time to do it. It's very much so possible to do it with everything on the car as well though, so don't feel like you have to do it now if you really don't want to. You just have to be a little more careful so that you don't run into the coilover. With the coilover properly bolted in, we can start working on preload. It's the same process as before. Tighten the top collar until you can just barely rotate the spring around with your hand, and then move up the locking collar to the bottom of it. Keep that locking collar in place and tighten the top until you can fit the spanner between the two. Then you're good to move the locking collar up and tighten everything down permanently. With that, we can move on to control arms, or in this case, control arm. The front had two control arms which met in the middle. They connected to the spindle. The rear just has one, but it mimics a very similar function. The design difference makes a lot of sense when you realize that the entire front spindle is going to rotate when you turn, so it simply couldn't have been designed like the rear. This adjustable arm has heim joints replacing the silicone bushing. Once again, just like the front, these are adjustable so that we can set proper alignment specs at the lower ride height. For now, we're going to try to get it as close as possible to the OEM length, and that means reusing my favorite technique of lining it up with the OEM hardware. The only new thing is the additional hardware that the adjustable control arm had. These little black pieces are shim spacers. I say shim spacers because they're kind of both. They act as a shim by sitting inside of the heim joint, narrowing the hole that the bolt actually goes into so it fits snug. And at the same time, they act as spacers because they stick out a fair amount past the end of the heim joint so that it fits properly. Gotta have room for this extremely long bolt after all. They're a little odd looking, but the fitment is perfect. The hardware fits snug, and after a bit of adjusting, we were able to properly mimic the length of the OEM piece, meaning we were good to bolt it onto our new suspension. And with that, here is what the new rear suspension is going to look like. This is absolutely a notable improvement over the OEM suspension. The only thing I would change, and the only thing I wish, is that I had a sandblasting chamber and a powder coater. It would be really, really cool to make these top pieces perfect again, and someday I really hope to have the tools and the space to do that. But right now I'm working outside. It's also important to make sure you appreciate the small things. Perfect or not, this is a major improvement. As you've probably guessed, reinstallation follows the same steps as removing the OEM suspension, but it's a lot easier because there's nothing fighting you. This piece is by nature smaller than the OEM suspension, so you don't at all have to worry about prying it out. You simply have to rebolt the top part to the car, push the spindle back in place, slide the bolt through, and then use a jack to push up the lower control arm so it meets the new height of the new suspension. With all the bolts in place, you're good to tighten everything down now. Plus, since these are heim joints, you don't even have to worry about getting the car to ride height to tighten everything down. You're kinda just good to go. So just like the front, we're simply setting the rear to preload height to begin with. When we did this on the TT, it was totally fine. Those Bilsteins were equal front and rear. These BCs, however, seem to be sitting a fair amount lower in the rear than they do in the front, at least before any height adjustment. We're gonna move on to the other side for now, but we're gonna keep this in mind. The other side follows an identical process, and since we just did it, it took even less time to complete. I honestly think suspensions are quite satisfying to work on. I mean, it totally sucks when bolts are seized and stuff like that happens, but overall, they're very mechanical, and at least to me, mechanical things are by nature very interesting. So it's a pretty enjoyable process. The only thing I did notice is my lower control arms on the rear are a little worse for wear. They're not bad by any means, but they do look notably crustier than the rest of the car. Maybe we'll replace them or recoat them down the road. Tensions were high at this point. This was the last part of the suspension I was planning to put on, and after this, we were just going to start tuning everything and getting the car actually set up. This was supposed to be a really cool reveal. Seeing the car at its true ride height, finally fixing the Jeep wheel gap that has been plaguing this car since I've owned it. However, we ran into a minor setback.
So I thought this might be a problem, and it was. The car is currently too low to get the jack out from underneath. So we got to figure something out. Whoops.
Yeah, so it turns out, unlike Bilstein's, setting the BCs at preload height does not necessarily mean that it's equal front and rear height-wise. That's okay, because the next day I was planning on adjusting it anyways, but that didn't fix the issue at hand. In the rear, the car couldn't even get down to ride height because it was sitting on the jack. The jack could not go any lower, and it could not come out. I had to use the OEM scissor jack to remove it.
Well, the suspension's entirely on. We're not done. We got to come back tomorrow and adjust everything and make sure that there's equal ride height in the front and the rear, because currently we have a squatted B5S4, which I don't think I've ever seen, nor do I want to ever see again. But the back's looking pretty good. Woo! Gross.
Well, here you go. The B5 has an aftermarket suspension. Wonderful fitment in the rear, horrible in the front. It's really what everybody wants their S4 to look like. I'm gonna be doing a whole video on a height adjustment and actually setting this car up to be driven, but I honestly think squatted S4s go against all of the morals I have, so what you see me doing here is adjusting ride height before we actually adjust ride height. Since it's a new suspension, I'm gonna let the car sit for a bit so that it can compress and sink down. If we start adjusting the height before the suspension settles and it sinks down, we're just gonna have to raise the car up, so it makes sense to just be patient and wait for it to settle and then come back. But But that being said, I couldn't stomach the idea of having the car sit for a week with the rear lower than the front while I wait for it to settle. That would be pretty gross. If you're worried about me not going into detail on how I'm adjusting this, don't be. I'm dedicating a whole episode to that and setting up dampening properly, and that'll be pretty soon in the episode release lineup. All in all though, I think today's episode was a major success. This car has an upgraded suspension now. It's on coilovers and everything is fully adjustable. The rear suspension looks so much better than it did before, and the front is so much better as well. This is a major upgrade over stock, and even though the car has not settled and the ride height is not permanent yet, it looks incredible. Since it's gonna sink down a bit, this isn't gonna be the final fitment this car has, but man does it look better than it did before. In the future, we're also gonna give this car proper wheels, so that'll change it too. But for now, and compared to what it was before, I think this is a big improvement, and we're definitely on the right track. I haven't fully decided what kind of fitment I want to aim for with the setup. I'm also starting to look for some wheels, so if you have any suggestions that I should keep my eye out for, let me know. Either way, thank you so very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, consider dropping a like and subscribing for more. It's the best way you can help support me and my channel. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Have a wonderful day.